Here we go. There she is. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are here giving thanks for the opportunity to learn together. It's Thursday, April 30th, and this is the fourth of our seven-session spring semester called Treasures of Talmud. So we're at the midpoint of our learning, and midpoints make a good moment to pivot. So we are going to pivot in kind of the relational frame that we've established for this curriculum, where we're exploring the rabbinic mind on the big question of what does it mean to be human? Excuse me. Um, so we spent the first three sessions in what we may think of as a horizontal frame, meaning how the rabbis provided ethical guidance and spiritual wisdom around what we owe one another, right? What people owe one another in relationship to and with one another. So, in human dignity, in the ethics of our speech, and in matters of truth. And perhaps to our surprise last week, we saw that the rabbis are open and indeed encouraging of the possibility that we might subvert truth for at least what dictated by context or circumstance might be an even higher value. Usually the vector is between truth on the one hand and peace on the other. So that's kind of the seesaw of balancing warm and harmonious human relations, right? That was last week. You can go, if you haven't seen it or if you weren't able to make all of our class last week, you can go onto YouTube where we record all of these sessions. Today, we're going to pivot from the horizontal frame, what human beings owe one another in relationship to and with one another, to the vertical frame. So we're going to focus on the relationship between us and God. So think of this as the kind of the vertical axis of our humanity and especially our Judaism. And so the theme for today's study is the covenant in the rabbinic imagination. So we're well outside the covenantal frameworks that the Torah offers, beginning in the very first part of the book of Genesis. Covenant is brought forward as a notion that binds the divine to all of humanity. The first instance of covenant being raised in the text is following the catastrophe of the flood that destroyed the world, and Noah, Mrs. Noah, their family, and all those pesky animals on the ark are recovenanted to God, or covenanted really to the for the first time to God after the ravage of the flood, and they are now, safely ashore at Mount Ararat, and a new world begins. And this new world, this post-diluvian world, this post-flood world, will be premised on a covenant that binds humanity and God. And then we get into many other iterations of covenant throughout the Torah, next in the Abraham saga, where Abraham and his household are covenanted to God through the binding sign of circumcision. And again, when the Israelites are liberated from Egypt and given law at Sinai, that is another establishment of the covenant. And now the whole Jewish people will be in covenant to God, but not just because they have, for instance, a selective favoritism of their ancestors, Abraham and his progeny, but also because they are now bound to God in law. And I could give many other instances where the Torah itself deploys covenant. So obviously, this is a norm and a notion deeply ingrained in Torah, and widespread throughout Jewish storytelling, Jewish narrative, how Jews see ourselves in the world, but also in relationship to the divine. The word brit or covenant is kind of the catch-all for that relationship. But what did covenant mean to the rabbis? In order to help us unpack that question, we're going to start with another opening framing question. And this time, I would welcome your responses, acknowledging up front there are no right or wrong answers here. This is a very personal invitation for you to reflect on the meaning of covenant. So I'll put it this way. If God were in a relationship with you the way you are in a relationship with another person, what kind of partner do you imagine God would be? I'll say it again just so you can kind of let it land. If God were in partnership with you the way you are with another, in relationship with another human being, what kind of partner do you imagine God to be? So it's just, okay, Mom, I saw your hand to go up. So you just have to unmute. Okay, I can see you can speak now.
Okay. Honest.
Great.
Even
Okay,
if
so
if there was a an observation that would be painful to share, honest. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
great,
I
beautiful.
want to, I want to add to that since we've been married a few months. Um, I would say a person that always has your back.
Okay, supporter, supportive, honest, there for you, present. Um, Great. Thank you for getting the ball rolling.
Welcome.
I'll read what Cynthia commented in the chat box to me. Equal, but not understanding all of God's intentions, right? So there'd be a sense that maybe we are partners in this relationship, but sometimes hard to figure out exactly what's going on in God's mind or way of being. By the way, anyone who is in a relationship with any other person, it's actually not that different, right? We can always, no matter how deeply we may know another person, we may not understand, we will not understand all of that person's intentions. Audrey,
Extremely demanding.
thank you.
Extremely.
Yeah, often the way you answer this says something about how you were parented, but I'll go on. I'll let that sit. It's only because Audrey and I know each other really, really well. Yep. Okay. God as demanding, extremely demanding. Good. George, please. Unmute your.
Yeah, I would be very wary. There have been too many instances in our history where too many of us have been murdered.
Right.
Mhm.
And I would be very, very careful because I don't know what direction uh, he would take.
Inscrutable, unreliable, possibly, right? There have been that's an answer that has ample reinforcement in traditional Jewish theology, Jewish literature, particularly post-Holocaust, a deep and abiding sense of divine abandonment.
Yes.
And so it prompts many a Jewish theologian to ask and then answer the question, where was God when we needed God most? And therefore, I would say one of the great challenges in the long evolving arc of Jewish theology has been if there is this covenant that the Bible itself extols and the rabbis amplify, what about those moments where we as a Jewish people were left to fend for ourselves, victimized, brutalized, and in other ways violated in ways that appear on their face to violate the covenant itself, right? If God is promising always to be there for us, how do we explain those, just traumatic chapters in Jewish memory that attest to, I mean, or they attest otherwise, in our experience. And what's perhaps most remarkable about Jewish theology is that such inquiries and such demands of God are not suppressed. They are, in fact, canonized. It is not heresy to say, God, you've let me down. God, what about that covenant? I mean, that is the thrust of the entire book of Job. I suffer. I know I didn't do anything to deserve it. What do you have to say for yourself? That too is Jewish theology, perhaps Jewish theology par excellence, right? Russell, please.
Well, I think all of this is a rather benign view of I think it's a relationship where I'd actually be happiest when he's not around. Like I'm glad he's there, but I think he'd be very demanding. I think he'd be opaque. I think he would have no sense of proportion. Little things and big things would be of equal valence. He would be slow to anger, but get very angry when he does. As I say, I think it's a relationship where I'm glad I'm in this relationship, but would really be happiest when he's not around.
Thank you. Karen, please unmute yourself kindly. There it is.
In a Torah study we did last Saturday at Sharing Shabbat, there was readings from Pirkei Havot, and I can't find the exact one, but I was left with the feeling that it's a two-way street. In other words, that it was God who could be embarrassed by us.
Mm.
And therefore, it led me to a feeling that I'd never had before, that I didn't want to embarrass God. And therefore, it did sort of feel like the child, parent thing,
Hmm.
where one embarrasses the other by poor behavior at various ways, at various stages in their life.
Mm.
Anyhow, so I'm kind of going against what others have said or the other direction by saying that I don't want to act badly and therefore embarrass God.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, and your terminology here points to a legitimate way of understanding God in the long arc of Jewish thought, Jewish literature, which is highly anthropopathic. I would say foremost anthropopathic, a great word, we don't use it enough. It means ascribing human-like emotional qualities to something that is not a human. So God is frequently depicted in anthropopathic terms, and that will be very much on display in the texts we're looking at today.
Well,
And also,
I was also saying personifying. I mean, I was
personified, right. And so
in
but
general sense.
personify can actually there are many different nuances and shades to personification. So anthropopathism is a specific kind of personification, ascribing to a non-human entity human-like emotional qualities. The other much more familiar word for us is anthropomorphism, which literally means shaped like a person. So God is also described as having human form. I would say before we get into a highly anthropomorphized image of God, that the rabbis were not naive, right? The rabbis understood that God does not have arms and legs and noses and mouth. So we're gonna ask, therefore, if we assume that the rabbis are deploying this with total self-awareness that they're speaking in allegorical, metaphorical language. They don't really believe that God is embodied in human form. Then what does this text come to teach us? Without delay, then let's go into the text that we're examining today. So the first text that I'd like us to look at, both texts today come from Tractate Berakhot, the very first tractate in the Babylonian Talmud. So again, six are the orders of the Mishnah. The first is Ziraim, which means seeds. It is a tractate in the Mishnah all about agriculture. The Babylonian Talmud expatiates at some length on uh, the very first subcategory of the order called seeds, which is Tractate Brachot. In fact, it's the only tractate from the order seeds that the Talmud expands. So the book of Brachot is where it all begins for Talmud study. It's all about the act and the art and the discipline of blessing, and therefore all Jewish prayer norms are encoded into Tractate Brachot. And what does this have to do with seeds? Well, we learn that the art and the act and the discipline of prayer and of reciting blessings is intimately linked to our acknowledgement of the natural cycles of time and the ongoing creation of the world. So prayer actually puts a person in deeper relationship with the created universe and therefore with the will of its creator. But at least in the mind of the rabbis, playing off of the biblical substrate of Talmudic thought, prayer is really all about linking oneself to time and orienting oneself in time. Prayer is a way of enshrining time rather than place in the Jewish imagination. Though place has its place as well. In fact, the sugyot, the paragraphs immediately preceding and following the sections we're looking at today, do discuss whether prayer in a synagogue offers some added value in terms of its efficacy. In other words, does prayer work better if you pray it in a shul than along the road or in a cave where you might be accosted by bandits or prostitutes or demons? That's actually one of the framing contexts for this whole section. It's great reading. We're going to look at just a few meaningful extracts from that section, starting in Brachot, tractate Brachot 6a. And this is, we're picking up, as you can see in paragraph 17, as Safaria enumerates. And it's part of a longer discussion that talks about how God shows up in human company. We even have one of these verses from this section of Talmud inscribed on the top cornice of the shelves in the Sifriya, the temple library here, that say, when two sit together and study Torah, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests among them. The idea being that if you want to summon God, the best thing you could do is find a chavruta, find a partner for study, and sit down with that person. And so the rabbis doing what they do in this discursive kind of extrapolation from the main thread, they're going off into kind of like side alleys here, the rabbit holes of Talmud, which is where much of the wisdom resides, to contemplate how God shows up in our lives. And then we have this fascinating question. So we're looking at Brachot 6a passage, paragraph 17, Amar Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ada. Right, so you can see in the corresponding English to what I've highlighted, the Gemara cites another agadic statement that Steinsaltz just saying, detour. We have another agada, meaning Jewish folklore here, right? Agada, like Haggadah, storytelling. So the Gemara is going to bring us to a folkloric little nugget attributed to one Rabbi Avin bar Ada, who is quoting their teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, so that's the setup. And then it goes on to say, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, minayin, where do we get it? Minayin just means from where. Where do we derive the idea, Shehakadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One, blessed be God, maniach tefillin. How do we know that God wears tefillin? Okay, anyone familiar with tefillin? You know what tefillin are? They're phylacteries. Sure. It's my favorite, like, meaningless definition of one noun with another noun. Help me understand, Rabbi, what are tefillin? Phylacteries. Great. My question is answered. I'll show you. I have a little show and tell today. One moment. So these are my great-grandfather's tefillin. My dad knows these well because he had them beautifully preserved. So tefillin are these, they're made entirely of leather. That's just the outer box, which is paper, and the other box there. And you can see it's been very artistically kind of framed in this vacuum sealed lucite box where it won't further degrade. The leather's already pretty fragile. And there are two different tefillin that are worn. This one is tefillin shel rosh. So this little box sits on the forehead while the strap goes around the head, and then the tail runners kind of just hang loose behind you over your shoulders. And this is the tefillin shel yad, the tefillin that goes over the arm. And you can see there's like a little slip knot here that is bound to the upper arm. And then the long thread of leather is wrapped 7 times around the forearm on one's left hand typically, because when you are standing at rest and you have your tefillin bound up here, the box is here as close as it could be to the heart while still enabling some range of motion. And then the 7 straps go around, or the strap goes around 7 times. And then as you bind it upon the hand, the custom is to wrap it in a prescribed way that inscribes an image of the letter shin on the hand with the specific wrapping can designate an image of the letter dalit and then the letter yud. So there's a way to wrap tefillin so that it actually spells out the name Shaddai, which is one of the many biblical epithets for God. My great-grandfather Louis Kleinerman and his tefillin, which make for great show and tell. So the image here, of course, is the Holy One, God Himself wears tefillin. Okay, it's an astonishing claim. And again, I would add here, I don't think the rabbis are naive. I don't think the rabbis literally believed that God wears tefillin, but let's see what they're trying to drive at here. So bringing the text back on screen. How do we know that the Holy One, blessed be God, wears tefillin? And they do what rabbis do. They prove it with a proof text. The Lord has sworn by his right hand and by the arm of his strength. Okay, so the line from Isaiah chapter 62, verse 8 suggests that God is in somehow a deep relationship, the arm of his strength, which is not the right hand. So therefore, the other arm, the arm of his strength, must be the left. And what makes it strong, since the left is not a dominant hand, it must be the tefillin. Like there's a whole lot of, kind of midrashic fun and games going on in the way they use proof text here. Nothing about this text literally portrays God wearing actual phylacteries. It does, however, give the rabbis a little bit of extra grounding for this idea of God having hands that connote strength, right? And you can even see here, Steinsaltz adds, since it is customary to swear upon holy objects, it is understood that God's right hand and the arm of his strength are the holy objects upon which God swore. Well, I have a slightly different read on it, and that's just Steinsaltz's way of basically saying that it's a nice verse about God's hands, and that kind of goes to show you that God must wear tefillin, right? The proof text is, I don't think it adds much, because obviously the rabbis are winking and nodding, I believe, that they know God doesn't literally wear tefillin. And there's even more commentary here. Perhaps the right hand is a reference not to an actual hand or an appendage of God, but rather to the Torah. Citing the verse, from God's right hand, a fiery law came for God's people in the very tail end of Deuteronomy. And the arm of his strength, meaning the left hand, as I noted, refers to the tefillin. As it is stated, the Lord gave strength to his nation in the form of the mitzvah of phylacteries. Okay, well, maybe. And you're going to see they're really into the proof texting here. I'm not particularly moved by the proof texting. I'm more moved by what surfaces in paragraph 20. So now that we've established that God actually wears tefillin, and we've used proof text to prove the concept, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to Rabbi Rav Chia bar Avin. Okay, so that's the setup here. Hane tefillin demare alma ma kativ buhu. All right, so Hane tefillin demare alma. So literally it says, what is written in the tefillin demare alma. an Aramaic phrase that means the master of the universe. Alma is Aramaic for olam. Mar means master. It's actually where you get the word mister from, mar. And even today in formal Hebrew, if you address somebody as sir, you would say Mar Horowitz or Mar Steinberg. So Mare Alma is Mr. World, like what the master of the world. Ma kativ buhu. What's written in those tefillin? Yes, of course, because if God is wearing tefillin, they must function like actual tefillin. Now, quick question, little Jewish trivia here, which I assume most of you know. What famous passages are included in the handwritten parchment that is folded into the crevices of a box of tefillin? Like what's actually in there? You don't open it up. Like once you put it on, once you get your tefillin, the box remains sealed. Mom and Dad?
It's the Shema and its blessings.
Right.
Hero
It's
is
like a mezuzah for the body, right, Cynthia?
no, Hero Israel, yes.
Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai Echad, right? So that's, of course, like, Judaism 101. That's what you're doing. You're putting these words which suggest that we are bound in covenant to the one God, right? It's sort of the declaration of faith par excellence in the Jewish tradition. Now, having established that, the question is therefore asked, so, nu, what's in God's tefillin? Because if ours say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, that would be kind of an idle boast that has no covenantal function. God wears tefillin that say, hi, I'm God, right? Listen up, O Israel, I'm God. Like, no, of course not. And here's where things get really theologically so daring and wild. So what are God's tefillin say? It says, Amarle, and then there's a quote. He responded to the question, what's in God's tefillin? Umi ke'amcha Yisrael goya chad ba'aretz. All right, so a verse from way out in the outfield of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. First Chronicles chapter 17, verse 21. Who is like your people Israel? Goy echad. A goy just means a nation, by the way. It's not a pejorative in biblical Hebrew. The way goy is typically a light pejorative today, meaning a Gentile. Goy just means a nation. It's very similar to the word like Am Yisrael. Goy Yisrael, it's unusual formulation, but it is not impossible grammatically in Hebrew. It's a totally logical statement. And notice what the rabbis are doing. They've inverted the covenantal relationship so as to be an appropriate statement for God to embrace in the wearing of tefillin, right? If human beings, the Jews wear tefillin that say Adonai Echad, God is wearing corresponding or symmetrical tefillin, mirror image tefillin that say Goy Echad. Just as we affirm you are one God, God is wearing these kind of magical mirror image tefillin that say, and yes, Israel is unique. Israel is one people, one unique people. Echad, not just in the sense of one among many, but echad in the sense of uniqueness. And you can see what Steinsaltz offers by way of his gloss here, which is quite lovely. God's phylacteries serve to connect him in a sense to the world, the essence of which is Israel. Again, in the imagination of the rabbis. I will never, give the rabbis a hard time for their Judeo-chauvinism, right? Of course, the rabbis are writing a book that premises the centrality of the Jewish people, not just to how we live our lives. Like, yeah, this stuff's important because you're Jewish. You have to preserve tradition because you're Jewish. The rabbis are actually proposing a kind of cosmic centrality to the entire project of Yisrael, right? That God had a special design in creating, sustaining, and covenanting God's self to this one people. And that is part of God's plan for the unfolding creation of the universe. This is a very, very heady concept, but I think if you don't fully understand that, you might just dismiss the passage out of hand and say, oh my God, this is so Judeo-chauvinistic. I know you would all walk around like Starbucks talking about Judeo-chauvinism, which is a word I invented this morning. But I think you can read what the word conveys, right? That the same way some people have an allergy to some of the specific language of chosenness in the prayer service. When you get up and say Baruch et Adonai Hamvarach, and you're doing the Torah blessings, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim, God who chose us from among all peoples. And then again in Aleinu at the end of the service when we say, God, you have chosen us from among all other people. Some Jewish people, including the entire Reconstructionist movement, basically rejects the notion of chosenness as Judeo-chauvinism. I don't. I think that it's intrinsic to rabbinic theology and cosmology that God put the nation of Israel at the center of the divine plan for the universe. Make of that what you will. I actually think it puts on us not a kind of award for specialness, but rather a burden or a high bar that we must aspire constantly to reach, right? So therefore, chosen for what becomes the important response question, right? Okay, I'm chosen, but that doesn't just mean you've singled me out because I'm intrinsically special. It means that in the language of Mission Impossible, here's your mission should you choose to accept it. That's what it means to be a Jew. Like you do have a special identity, you do have a special mission in the world, and actually it's to be a light unto the nations and to show the rest of humanity how this is supposed to go. Okay. I happen to love it. I love the notion of chosenness. Okay, Joe, please.
I always think or question who wrote what and why. I'm just wondering if the wording of God's phylacteries, of God's tefillin, says it to remind him about what he promised us.
Beautiful. Great. So God is wearing these devices, these amulets, not so much for divine protection, but as a sacred reminder of the entire, again, I'm calling it the project of Israel, not the nation state of Israel today, but the project of the Jewish people is very, very important in the way the rabbis understood the meaning of our existence here in this vast you know, and strange universe. The rabbis are here to affirm that there's a meaning to the Jewish peoples having come to be and been sustained through such time and tribulation already by the time of the rabbis, what the Jews had already been through, what Eretz Yisrael, what the Am Yisrael had already been through, is a testament to there must be some special reason for our being. And that God needs to be reminded of it is quite a lovely and, again, anthropopathic notion. Let's read on and see where the rabbis go for just two more small paragraphs, or two or three. Two. Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzchak continues. So Steinsaltz is just reminding us who was speaking in the previous sugya. Umi mishtabach kedusha brichu. So we've flipped to Aramaic as Talmud does. And is the Holy One, blessed be God, glorified? B'shivchaihu de Yisrael, through the praise of Israel. Like, is God actually glorified through Israel's praise? In is Aramaic for ken. Yes. In dichtiv. Yes, it is. Yes, God is glorified through our praise. In other words, this is going to lead to another theologically audacious, even astonishing claim, namely that without us, without the Jewish people, God really isn't there. God's glory can't be seen, and so it kind of is a play on the old tree falling in the forest question, right? If nobody is there to praise God, if the Jewish people weren't here to give glory to God, does God's glory even exist in the world? It's an astonishing claim. We're going to play with it a bit. How do we know this? Well, there's a proof text, as always. Et Adonai he'emarta hayom. All right, so and that's, I believe, from Deuteronomy. I will double check that in my source sheet here. The translation, as indicated by the juxtaposition of two verses. Yeah, Deuteronomy 26, verses 17 and 18. I'll flip to the English so we can follow more readily. As it is stated, you have affirmed, He'emircha hayom, that Adonai is your God. And then the passage goes on to say, and that you will walk in God's ways and keep God's laws and commandments and listen to God's voice. And then the very next verse, the subsequent verse states, and God has affirmed this day. And I just want to point out that the Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, so God responded to Israel, Atem asituni chativa achat ba'olam. The Lord has affirmed this day that you are God's treasure, as God spoke to you, to keep God's commandments. From these two verses, it is derived that the Holy One, blessed be God, said to Israel, you have made me a single entity, a chativa in the world, for you singled me out as separate and unique. In other words, props to the Jewish people for this whole monotheism thing. Props to the Jewish people for saying, only God is God. God is radically unique, unlike anyone, anything, any force in the universe. Only God, right? And because of this, I will make you, meaning the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, a single entity in the world. That is to say, as Steinsaltz glosses, you will be a treasured nation chosen by God. And it goes on from there in the next paragraph, which is the last we'll read before we flip forward to the second section we're looking at today. You have made me a single entity in the world, as it is stated that Israel declares God's oneness by saying, there it is, the words inside the Tefillin, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, from Devarim 6:4. And because of this, I will make you a single entity in the world, unique and elevated with the utterance, who is like your people Israel, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. That's the line from the book of Chronicles. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be God, is glorified through the glory of Israel, whose praises are written in God's Tefillin. All right, so what's being proposed here, again, where did we start our class today? We started with flipping the horizontal axis of relationship 90 degrees, flipping it on its axis, and looking now at the vertical dimension of how does the Talmud, how do the rabbis understand the connection between God and humanity, but God and the Jewish people specifically? That too is a relationship whose parameters are defined by this idea of covenant, which is at root a reciprocal arrangement. Like what the rabbis are really emphasizing here should really open your eyes to the radicalness of the proposition that, namely, the for the relationship, for the covenant to exist, it has to be reciprocal. It can't just be that there's a unilateral downward demand on us as Jews to live our lives in accordance with God's laws and strictures, and that's the covenant. It is rather, I would say, much bolder than that, that our existence mutually depends on one another. Without God, there's no Jewish people, and without the Jewish people, if I dare say it, there is no God. I think that that is actually a sentence that is made permissible, that is opened up by the deepest understanding of what this text is here to convey. That's my view. I'd love to hear some of your views on this. Mom and Dad first, please.
This is why the Jews had such a hard time with Rome, among other foreign powers.
Say more.
Because it was not the situation in the ancient world, especially among the Romans, that, that there was only one God, and they probably would have tolerated Judaism and the Jews just fine had the Jews not insisted that, there was one God and that you can't erect a statue of Caligula in our temple and you can't make Caesar Augustus a god. That's not the way we think about things. And that led to worlds of trouble for the
For our
Jews,
people. Yep.
for our people.
Beautiful. Judy Gross, please.
I'm just trying to think of how we consider all humanity in relationship to us as a people. We're here, the Torah has led us here, I guess. But what do we think about other people? Is everyone created in God's image or only the Jews? I mean, then there you go into a chosenness that we can't abide, and that's why everybody hates us. But
I don't think it's mutually exclusive to acknowledge the ways in which the rabbis foreground the Jewish people, the Jewish experience, and the purpose of the Jewish people in God's design for the unfolding creation of the universe. And I don't think it's mutually exclusive on the one hand to affirm that and the centrality of that project to the rabbis, and on the other hand affirm that all are made in God's image, and that the way Judaism understands our relationship with the rest of humanity, and we spent a lot of time last week
Yeah.
on
Go ahead.
Jews and Gentiles, is
Right.
that each person is actually an image of God. And so what you do on the vertical axis, even if it is, you know, you recognize that God has bound God's self in covenant just to the Jews, the way the rabbis understand it. The obligation from Jewish people to non-Jewish people is actually still mediated by the understanding that if another person is actually a representation of God on earth, then the same force of obligation resides in the horizontal as it does in the vertical. Does that make sense? Right?
Hmm.
That the radical proposition, it's twofold radical proposition or threefold, because even though there's a special relationship between Jewish people and God as premised by the rabbis, the relationship with other people is no less about God. The Gentiles may not have the same quality of covenantal bond with God the way Jewish people or the way the rabbis understood it, but our obligations to and with one another, irrespective of religion or ethnicity or whatever project we assign or align ourselves with in our daily affairs, irrespective of that, we have to treat them as if they are God on earth,
God's people, yeah.
right? Other people are actually also ways of connecting to God. Thank you. And Buber goes deep into that, of course. Buber's theology of relationship is not premised on the Judaism of your partner. It's premised on the divinity of every human being. But your sense of obligation to the other flows
Okay.
at least in part because you understand that this is what God requires of us, that we elevate God's presence in all of our affairs, that glorifying God isn't just something you do in synagogue, right? The glory of God, whatever that may mean to you, isn't just expressed through prayer or song. It's expressed through mitzvot. It's expressed through study. It's expressed through how you treat the person who is, in a blanket and addicted to drugs on the streets of New York, because that person is also the divine.
And the oneness of all is
Right.
part of that.
Uh-huh. Right. And therefore,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. Thank you, Judy. Beautiful. Arlene, please.
Um, I believe that your father opened up the statements in probably the best way when he mentioned the time frame that all of this was written in. The history of the world at that time was that there was a belief among so many different peoples that there were multiple gods, that there were many different groups that you would pray to. And so my feelings are that what Judaism was trying to do was say, no, there's only one ultimate God that we should be accountable to.
Beautiful.
And
Right.
okay,
I mean, obviously, the rabbis are writing under the heel of Rome.
of
So,
course,
yeah, exactly. This was not an abstraction in their lives. Like
no,
the massive statuary to the gods of Rome and to the emperors of Rome, who were like the pharaohs of Egypt, gods incarnate in or at least that was the
right.
imposed power structure that the Roman Empire put upon its subjects, who were effectively slaves to the empire, especially the Jews, who being a vanquished people. I mean, the
Mhm.
rabbis saw how this played out. They understood idolatry in lived terms, not as a biblical abstraction. Joe,
Right.
please. Yep. Thank you, Arlene.
Mm.
Joe, if you want to unmute yourself and comment, your hand is up. Nope, still muted. There you go.
Okay. Uh, Judy raised a question in my mind about, and I don't want to make this into a comparative religion uh, session, but I'm curious now of what the Christians or non-Jews, not other denominations, but Christians, when they refer to, quote, God, they don't refer to really God. They refer to Jesus, the Son of God. What are they assuming God is in that sense? And why are they praying and bowing down or whatever you want to call it, supplicating themselves to the Son of God rather than to God Himself?
I mean that it is a deep detour, and I've taught full semester classes on Christian theology and Christian scripture, or as it was hilariously and memorably recorded in the HUC course book. You could take a class with the now late Professor Michael Cook, my teacher, on Christian sculptures. But one of my favorite encountered typos in my life. Christian scripture, I think, makes a strong case for the divinity of Jesus, as you know, Jesus being both God's son, but also the divine incarnate. Again, I'm giving you an insider's perspective here. I'm not going to editorialize from my perspective, which is informed by my academic study of Christian scripture and Christian theology and lived Christian practice, but rather, what does Christianity mean from the inside? The operating premise here is what is written in the book of John, that God so loved the world that God gave us God's only begotten Son, who died for our sins, and by whose miraculous resurrection, all people who have faith are redeemed and saved. Okay, I mean, that could take us, again, semesters and semesters to unpack, but the idea is that God coming down into the world in the body of a man who was both, beloved, but mostly persecuted, physically and emotionally scourged, murdered by the state, and then resurrected. Like that is the way the Christians orient themselves to God's relationship with all of humankind. It's not just about the Christian people, because Christianity is not premised on peoplehood, it's premised on faith, right? So you become a Christian not by being the son of a Christian mother or the daughter of a Christian mother, the way matrilineal Judaism operates. It's not a peoplehood that way, it's a faith premise. And so if you affirm that you accept Jesus as your personal savior so that you can be redeemed from your original inherent sinfulness by accepting this token of God's love, Jesus is now your savior, you have therefore actually brought God into your life. All right, buy it or not, that's not really what I'm here to do. I'm not here to preach the gospel to the Jewish people. I'm here to teach a little bit about how Christians see how their faith operates and how different it really is from what the rabbis are talking about here. Mom and Dad, one more comment, but then let's get off of
I
Christianity.
want to just say, give a shout out to Joe, because I thought that was a great question. But as I recall, Karen Armstrong in her History of God, do I have that book right?
Yeah.
She went to some lengths at how difficult it was for the early church and the early popes to deal with thoughts of, well, you're really polygamous. If there's a Father, a Son, and a Holy Ghost, why do we suddenly have three gods here? Well, how are we going to unite that? So the Holy Trinity was kind of like this grand compromise to get through this,
Polytheistic, not necessarily
exactly, exactly. Yeah. Anyway,
okay.
That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Of course. Here we go. All right. So now we're going to flip just one page forward. We're going to look at Berakhot 7a. And we'll dwell in this page for the rest of our study this morning. So there's a lot of stuff that I skipped over, but basically it's all part of the same sugya. It's all part of the same long thread in Tractate Berakhot. So along the same lines, thank you, Steinsaltz, for the helpful little segue there. Just saying, we're still contemplating the same basic ideas. All right, if we can accept with much openness to metaphor that God wears tefillin, now the next question is posed. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yochanan said or asked in the name of Rabbi Yossi, Minayin, where do we get it? And Minayin is always a prompt to find a biblical verse that supports your question or your answer, right? Minayin, where do we get it? Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu mitpalel. If we accept the premise that God wears tefillin, does it not logically follow that God prays? And if we assume that God prays, mitpalel is like tefillah. Where does God do tefillah? How do we know this from the scripture? Shene'emar, vehavi otim el har kodshi, v'simachtim beveit tefillati. All right, so the verse that is brought is from the book of Isaiah. God says, I will bring them to my holy mountain and make them joyful in the house of my prayer. And as you can see, what's going on midrashically here, the verse does not say the house of their prayer, meaning the house where the people pray, but rather the house of tefillati. This is the key word that the rabbis are having a fun time with. It's the house of God's prayer. Well, okay. On its face, you might just say, yeah, that's just a poetic way of saying a sanctuary. The rabbis are reading it as they usually do, hyper literally. No, 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 the house of God's prayer. That's proof that God prays. So it doesn't say tefilatam. You can see in the Hebrew, tefilatam lo ne'amar. It doesn't say the house of their prayer, the prayer of the people, ela tefilati, my prayer. Mikan, from here, it is derived, she'akadosh baruch hu mitpalel, that the Holy One, blessed be God, prays. All right, so yes, let's just assume we're all totally satisfied with that midrashic answer, right? Now we've established, sure, God gets up every morning and prays. God gets up every morning, puts on God's tefillin, the magical tefillin that say, who is like the people of Israel, a goy echad ba'aretz, one unique nation among all the nations of the world. So what's going to follow next after Russell's comment or question is, okay, so God prays? Sure, God prays, because when God refers to the people coming to the holy mountain, it is not for the purpose of their prayer, tefilatam, but rather the text in Isaiah chapter 56 says, tefilati, the house where I pray. Sure. And therefore the rabbis have to ask the question that you're all dying to know. So new, what does God pray? Like what on earth would God, or what in heaven would God possibly pray for? All right, Russell, thought, comment, question.
I would expand that. Whom does he pray to?
And whom does God pray? Even more.
Because Christians have an answer to that through the Trinity. In Christian scripture, they say when God said, "Let there be light," who was he talking to? It was the Holy Trinity, that they were chatting amongst themselves, and that would make sense from a Christian perspective. But I'm struggling to see whether, perhaps this is suggesting to us that, prayer, the cynical among us would say that all prayers fall into two categories. Either you're asking for stuff, or you're saying you are great and I am small.
Right.
If you're Christian, there's a third one, which is please put in a good word for me with your dad.
Right.
But maybe this is suggesting to us, if God prays, that there is something other than asking for stuff and saying you are great and I am small. Maybe it is inviting us into some kind of elevated spiritual life where those hierarchies and those wants no longer exist.
Beautiful. Thank you. Right. So since Cynthia echoing Russell's point that especially in Jewish prayer, there are these different modes of generally in Judaism, two modes. Either God is great, thank you, God, right? Lots of praise, lots of gratitude. If you are accustomed to coming to shul pretty much exclusively on Shabbat and Chagim and Yamim Noraim, so Sabbath holidays and high holidays, then you are most familiar with prayers of gratitude, which also sometimes encode the idea, you are big, I am small. I am infinitesimally small in your grand universe, and yet you've showered me with such favor. Thank you, thank you, thank you, God. Now, the other, of course, is the petitionary mode, but if you're only accustomed to coming to shul on the Sabbath and the high holidays, you miss a lot of the petitionary prayers because that's actually the bulk of the weekday stuff. We stand in the tefillah and basically ask God 18-fold for God's blessings to flow to us. So the Shabbat inverts the pattern and we actually bless God, but we don't ask for much other than peace and for God to listen to our prayer. But petitions are restricted on Shabbat. Why? Because God is on Shabbat too. Like God's taking a break. Like don't nudge on Shabbat. You get to treat God like a cosmic vending machine 6 days of the week. And of course, Yom Kippur liturgy in particular is also petitionary. I'm not worthy, but please forgive me anyway. Rosh Hashanah is mostly praise and gratitude. You're the king, you're the boss. We enshrine you this day. Help us have a good year. But mostly it's praise. Okay, so now we've established God prays. The rabbis are going to ask, so new, what does God pray? And as Russell put front and foremost in his comment a moment ago, to whom does God pray? Like what's the deal here? We don't have a Trinitarian conception. We've just affirmed the radical uniqueness of God. Echad, 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 right? God is one. So what does one solitary unique entity pray? And to whom? All right, well, that's where we're going with this. So let's bring our text from 7a in Tractate Berakhot back on the screen. Okay, my mitzale, Aramaic here. So what is God actually praying for? My mitzale. Rav Zutra Bartovia said that Rav said, all right, there's the attribution. God says, and I love this in Hebrew, Yehi ratzon milfanai. Normally, when we use the formulation of Yehi ratzon, may it be the will, or may it be God's will, God is actually saying Yehi ratzon milfanai. We would say milfanecha, in your presence, O God. May it be your will. Here it says Yehi ratzon milfanai. May it be my will. So God is praying to God's self. That's the answer to the question. This is an internal monologue. Yehi ratzon milfanai, but what is God praying? And this is just one theologically audacious claim after another today. Sheyichbeshu rachamai et kaasi, that my mercy might overtake my anger. Vigolu rachamai al midotai, and that literally my mercy, my rachmanis, rachamai, Aramaic, rachmanis, my compassion, will like roll over like a wave, like will flow. Yigolu literally means like a cresting wave. It's the same verb to use what waves do. So my mercy will drown out all my other qualities. Ve'et naheg, and I will behave, I will respond, I will act, im banai, with my children, b'midat rachamim, through the quality of Rahmanis, through the quality of compassion. Ve'ekanes lahem, and I will bring them in lifnim, I will bring them inside, mishurat hadin. Literally, I will bring them beyond, or I will enter into their presence beyond the letter of the law. It's really an astonishing claim here. Basically, God's prayer, as imagined by the rabbis, is, I'm God. I know that I am prone to anger, as was stated in the opening frame for today's class. What are the qualities we might associate with God if we were in a relationship with God the way we are with another person? More than one person nodded when somebody suggested a God who may be slow to anger, but when God gets pissed, you feel it, right? But God is actually aware of this Achilles heel, so to speak, and says, I've got to be careful about that. May my attribute of mercy drown out all the rest so that I can enter into the presence of my people beyond the letter of strict justice. Whatever the people may merit because of the fact that we are flawed and we are frail and we fail and we disappoint and we fall short of God's standards for us all the time. Despite all that, please, God is saying to God's self, let me respond with compassion and not with what the law strictly requires. Wow. Right? If your mind's not just a little bit expanded by this, then I think you need more coffee this morning. Like you're not fully awake to how astonishing this is. So That's really the first movement here, right? And I want to go on from there to show you how this unfolds because there's actually a lot of goodies coming down the road. So let's go back to the text and just let it kind of wash over us. Okay, so that's the third paragraph. And now you have a similar teaching, and just for the sake of time, I'll keep us in the English except where the Hebrew really offers extra flavor, which it usually does. Similarly, it was taught in a Baraita, so that's a Mishnaic era teaching that was not actually compiled into the Mishnah. That Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, the high priest, said. So this is a really wild story. Once upon a time, on Yom Kippur, I entered the innermost sanctum, the Kodesh HaKodashim, of the Holy of Holies, to offer incense, like the priest was expected to do on Yom Kippur. If you ever remember the old Yom Kippur afternoon service from Gates of Repentance, the Maroon Machzor, there was this whole afternoon service that envisions the priestly worship in the ancient temple. I still kind of joke about it in the office because it has this very kind of like it sounds a little bit silly, the language, but the text in the prayer book was the ritual begins at dawn. The high priest clad in his white robes. Like, and by the way, this was my great dear friend, lives in Mamaroneck, and teacher Larry Hoffman was the main architect of that liturgy. So the ritual begins at dawn, right? The high priest goes into the innermost sanctum and pronounces the ineffable name of God. So this is what happens on Yom Kippur in temple times. So we've got this story now that this rabbi who happened to be a Kohen Gadol, he says, actually, I was there. And I went to offer incense on Yom Kippur like you do. And I saw a Katriel Yah, an Aramaic honorific term for God. So I saw the Lord of Hosts, one of the names of God expressing God's ultimate authority, as Steinsaltz helpfully reminds us, seated upon a high and exalted throne. If you want to see the image in mind, check out Isaiah 6, which is how God is depicted. And God said to me, Yishmael, my son, bless me. Okay, just sit with that for a moment. You have the high priest, who's also a rabbi, goes into the innermost sanctum of the temple, sees God seated there. Again, this whole passage is kind of playing with these anthropomorphic and anthropopathic ways of relating to God that I believe the rabbis were not so naive as to take literally, but I think they do take these images seriously. There's a playfulness to them, but there's also, I think, they're deploying this metaphorical, playful, overly literal, personified language to make bold theological claims, right? And so I believe that the message, the medium of using these highly anthropomorphic images actually underscores the audaciousness of the theology that underpins them. And that therefore there's a kind of uh, synchronicity between the vivid way in which this is all getting illustrated, which of course defies literal reading and requires us to go to a place where we're willing to suspend our belief in the literal or our disbelief in the literalism of this text in order to appreciate the theological boldness at root here. So Ishmael goes in and visits God, and God opens God's mouth. And what does God have to say? Ishmael, my son, bless me. Just what does it mean that God is asking a human being for a blessing? I'm actually, that's not a rhetorical question. I want you to sit with that for a moment and respond as you think you are moved to respond. What does it mean that God is asking this rabbi for a blessing? Audrey.
Perhaps it means it's one way of trying to reaffirm that God is God.
Okay, right. But the reaffirmation is the thing, right? And I don't think it's that God has a weak ego. I think God knows that God is God. But there's this deeper message that's getting consistently encoded in the sugyot we're studying today. God needs us to say it. God
Right.
needs, and by the way, whenever we say a blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, it's a direct address to God. Blessed are you, God. We are, in fact, doing what God is asking Rabbi Yishmael for in that moment. We're not saying God bless us. We are standing up in public, full-throated, saying, Baruch atah Adonai, over and over and over again. Blessed are you, God. I mean, again, if I can say it, because I think the theological audaciousness of what I've been saying this morning is provided in the text itself. This isn't like a Blake thing. This is a Talmud thing. It is, in order for God to be real, God needs us to bless
Right.
God.
Right.
Mom and Dad, thought,
Yeah.
question.
Um, uh, yes, indeed. And I think the whole thrust of what we've learned today is that how do you know the mind of another conscious being? You know, consciousness, it's such a hard thing to even know. But these are all techniques of trying to get the people of Israel to imagine a relationship with a consciousness of some kind that can be emulated, that has the characteristics that we would, understand. Like we know what it means to wrap tefillin, isn't it? Kind of a link to God that we can think that in that consciousness of God, there is also a reason to wrap tefillin. If in our consciousness there is a reason to bless the source of being, and to recognize that everything we get comes from that source, it's also reflexive for that being to acknowledge us and to bless us. So all of this, it seems to me, is just techniques to let the Jewish people feel as though they are connecting with another consciousness.
Beautiful. And Michelle's comment poetically and beautifully corroborates your line of thinking. Let's do Joe, Russell, and Judy, and then we'll finish our study. We'll have more text to contemplate.
I think this request by God is connected some way with the first question you asked us about if we had a relationship with God, and I think and to me it alludes to the possibility that God is just asking this. I forgot the name by going in uh, to reaffirm and confirm the relationship that was established to begin with.
That's right. And by the way, all of this would suggest that any covenantal arrangement that was made long ago, whether by Noah or by Abraham or by Moses or by Joshua, is only meaningful so long as it is personally reaffirmed each and every day by us and by God, right? It's not just this happened long ago and therefore it's forever binding. The covenant is renewed and made real every day through our intention. Russell, please.
Well, I think you hinted at this yourself when it tilts at the question, why did God create the world in the first place? Why did God create and why were we the last day of creation? Why did God need to create us at all? And I can think of a lot of different directions that question could go in. It could suggest, for example, that God cannot complete creation without us. And I mean, you began by speaking of this as a partnership. Uh, Another suggestion is that I think the literary term is objective correlative, inviting us, the objective correlative, if I remember it correctly, is where everyone looks at the lighthouse and reflects on it their own idea of what lighthouseness is. And it is asking God, perhaps it's saying that the relationship with God is such that each of us is invited to invent God, to create God in our own way.
I did a term paper my senior year of high school on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and it's really he who popularized that term, objective correlative. And you're exactly right. It's like a literary technique where a feeling is evoked in the reader, not so much by direct description, but by presenting some object, situation, some chain of events that still, nevertheless, is intended universally to prompt a reaction, a similar reaction across a diverse readership.
Well, and if I recall correctly, I think it was to the lighthouse in which this arose, that the object actually has no existence
Right.
other than the image that each of us projects upon it.
That's right. What it
And
evokes in us.
yes.
Beautiful. Is its raison d'être. Okay. Judy, last comment, and then we'll move forward.
Wow, this is so poet. So there's so much poetry here. The thing that I think God is doing is giving each of us the power and making us feel that we have the ability to bless God. It just makes us feel how important we are
Beautiful.
in this
So
relationship.
so let's affirm what all of you have just said, including Judy's perfect segue, and show you what Yishmael responds. So, okay, where we left the thread was God said, Yishmael, my son, bless me. Okay, new. So how does Ishmael respond? I said to him, I responded, the prayer that God prays. Ishmael's a smart rabbi. He's like, I know what blessing I'm going to give God. I'm going to give God God's own special blessing. May it be your will that your mercy overcome your anger, and may your mercy prevail over your other attributes, and may you act toward your children with the attribute of mercy, and may you enter before them beyond the letter of the law. In other words, don't just treat the Jewish people with strict justice. Be the nice God we know you are capable of being. Obviously, there's a kind of utilitarian end to all of this. Like, this is a prayer that would, if effectuated, be good for the Jews. But even more than that, it shows this intense, back and forth reciprocity of covenant, like this radical reciprocity. It's not a unilateral arrangement. And then I love this image. The Holy One, blessed be God, nodded his head. So God doesn't have anything to say other than, you done good. I like that prayer. This event teaches us that you should not take the blessing. And look at what the rabbis then do, which is just amazing. They take this whole fanciful agadic thread, which you have to take not literally, but you are invited to take seriously. This event teaches us that you should not take the blessing of an ordinary person lightly. Right? As Steinsaltz says, if God asks for and accepted a man's blessing, all the more so that a man must value the blessing of another man. Somebody blesses you, that's not a small thing. Doesn't matter who it is. Okay, so let's keep going because we have 15 minutes left in our study, and we have a few more goodies to extract from the passages that we're studying today. So there's a whole long bit here about the value of prayer in mitigating anger. All right. So, and again, that flows directly from what Yishmael said to God and what God says to God's self when God prays, right? It's like, I know I have this tendency to overreact when people disappoint me. I need to keep it in check, right? So I need to deal with my own anger issues. And Yishmael says, yeah, you've got some anger issues, buddy. But may your mercy prevail over them. So this is a longer form contemplation of God's anger. Again, that's sort of the implied substrate to this little section we're looking at. So the question the Gemara asks, as you can see in section 6, Umi ika ritcha kame de kudesha barichu, and is there anger before the Holy One, blessed be He? In other words, can we speak of God using terms like anger? Like, do we believe this? Anthropopathic, right? Really? And the Gemara says, oh, yes. There's that word Aramaic for ken, yes. Ditanya, as it was taught in a Baraita, ve'el zoem b'chol yom. God is pissed off every single day. How do we know that? Because the book of Psalms says so, right? We know the God of the Old Testament. It is, I think, much overplayed that God is, kind of, spicy. Like, don't get on God's bad side. That is actually, I think, a fair appraisal of the God of the Old Testament. But the idea that the God of the Old Testament is only a God of law and being enraged is really a flattening of the richness of the divine persona. And God is, I would say, much more a character who feels deeply because God loves deeply, right? Most of this comes from, I'm sure that the angriest you've ever been in your lives have been at people that you loved or thought you loved, right? Because that's where the anger comes from. It comes from a deep and heartfelt sense of betrayal. All right, so the Gemara is simply affirming, oh, yeah, we know this about God. God gets angry. But what do we do with it? And here's the passage that I think is just really fun and delicious. Okay, well, if God is furious every single day, how much time does God's anger last? And as was said at the very first few minutes of class today, God's anger lasts but a moment. And of course, this is the most Talmudic thing you will study today. The rabbis want to know, wait a minute. We know that God's anger lasts a moment, and in Hebrew, a moment is a rega. By the way, modern Hebrew parlance, rega, means just a moment. And there's even a hand gesture for it. If you do this with you clasp your four fingers to your thumb and you show this to somebody's face if they're trying to interrupt you while you're talking. Everyone knows in Israel this means rega or rak rega, just a moment, please. It's rude, but it's very normative in Israeli society. Rega, 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 just a minute. All right, but how long is a rega? It's not a it's not a specific calibrated measurement of time. It's just a moment. But of course, the rabbis aren't satisfied with that. They need to know how long is a rega? Well, you're going to find out. It is 158,888th of an hour. Okay? That's the measure. And I'm not even going to try it in the Aramaic. Well, I could, or it's in the Hebrew here. Yeah, never mind. It's 158,888th of an hour. 1 out of 58,888. That is a moment. Sure. The Gemara adds, and no creature can precisely determine that moment when God becomes angry, except for one person in all of the Jewish story, Bilam the wicked, about whom it is written, he who knows the knowledge of the Most High. All right. Sidebar here. Who is Bilam the wicked? All right, Dad, you definitely know this. Who's Bilam?
He was the itinerant wizard, prophet, probably one-eyed guy who was directed by King Balak to curse the Israelites.
Great.
And he has all these weird happenstances upon the road to do this. He meets a talking ass. He runs into Satan. And instead of cursing the Jewish people, God puts in his lips the words "Matovu oholecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael." How beautiful are your tents, O Israel, your dwelling places, O Jacob.
Beautiful. You know this because this was your bar mitzvah.
My bar mitzvah at WRT.
Right. Your second bar mitzvah.
Second bar mitzvah at age
63.
63.
Yeah, you did 50 plus 13.
Yeah.
And we brought you up on the bima and you gave a Devar Torah. So,
all that,
right.
yeah.
Late spring, early summer, we read from the book of Numbers, chapter 23 and associated passages. Parshat Balak. Balak, as you said, the king of Moab, has it in for the Jews. He wants them to be vanquished. He employs an itinerant wizard or a sorcerer, a Gentile, by the way, named Bilam, who has all of these kind of like mishaps and happenstances along the way to meet his summons on the mountaintop overlooking the encampment of the Israelite armies. Instead of doing what he was asked to do, which is curse them, he blesses them. Now, what the Talmud is proposing here is that Bilam, the sorcerer, alone of all people in the world, knew when God would be angry, knew the rega. And remember, how long is a rega? It's 158,888th of an hour. So it's, a microsecond. But Bilam and only Bilam could weaponize that, right? Because if Bilam got up to curse the Israelites at exactly the rega, at exactly that infinitesimally small moment when God was pissed off, it could inflict maximum damage on the Israelite armies. Of course, we know the story is that even the incredibly, if diabolically gifted Bilam could wreak such harm on the Jewish people, even Bilam is powerless before the power of God, who inserts into his very mouth words of blessing instead of words of curse. And those blessings, the blessing of a Gentile sorcerer, are the first words that you say when entering a shul for morning prayer at Shacharit services. Let that sit in too. Like literally when you pray, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, a Gentile sorcerer wrote these words and I'm singing them every morning. Like it's really crazy. By the way, there's a beautiful matovu on the new recording, WRT Sings, which I promise within the next 10 minutes I'll put a link in the chat box if you haven't seen it yet. You don't have to be there tonight, though we hope you're coming to our spring celebration, or at least writing us a nice check to support the temple. It really does help us do everything we do here at WRT. Dues alone and tuitions alone cover a lot of what we accomplish as a synagogue, but we really do rely very substantially on the free will philanthropy of our community. And this is our big fundraiser for the year. So if you are moved and able to participate, your gifts really do make a huge difference. So WRT Sings, there's a matovu. We don't happen to mention in the credits like words of a Gentile sorcerer who hated the Jewish people and who wrote a talking ass, but that's actually where it's again another one of those rabbinically audacious moves to put that as the first words you say. Yeah, we'll take those. Those are a good prayer. Okay. And then, by the way, they have to diminish. Well, he's not really a great prophet after all. They don't want to make too much of the fact that Bilam and only Bilam knew how to weaponize God's anger, could track the exact moment when God was angry, because that's what made him an employable sorcerer. Okay, anyway, but still a sorcerer. I mean, at the end of the day, it's very interesting. The take on Bilam is not a charlatan, but he's not all that, right? If you really want power on your side, go with God. Okay, so there's a fun coda that I think we have time for today. So I'm gonna just call up the last of our texts. So toward the end of this page of Talmud, we have a section where, again, what gets laid out in the section that I'm skipping is the quintessential passage about God's anger at the Jewish people. Can anyone guess what prompting circumstance led God to be angrier than God ever was before? Yeah, guess, Dad.
The golden calf.
Right. So this is the aftermath of the Egel Masecha, the golden calf, the most egregious breaking of faith in the still embryonic Israelite community in the wilderness. No sooner do they have, Moses up on the mountain about to bring down the law that they just can't handle God being removed, or Moses, more to the point, being removed from their presence. They have no basis on which to rely on an invisible God. For 400 years, they've been in the culture of Egypt, which, very much like the culture of Rome that has been discussed today, was a highly visualized imperial culture of divine power rendered in anthropomorphic or other animal recognizable familiar forms and images. They go from that to Moses disappearing onto a mountaintop, shrouded in smoke for 40 days. And then he's going to come back and tell them, by the way, God's invisible, but really expects you to demand, he demands everything from you. The people are having none of this. They build a golden calf. God is angry. All right. And then we get to the petition of Moses, which is where this is all leading. Since we are, remember, talking about that vertical axis of blessing and petition, which is the stuff of covenantal living between the Jewish people and God. So Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi regarding Moses' request that the divine presence rest upon Israel as it once had. So when Moses gets up there on Mount Sinai, after the shattering of the law, when when it is seen by Moses and God and Joshua that the people have made kind of monkeys of themselves cavorting around this idol, that they forced Aaron, who seemed all too willing to go along, but okay, they kind of pressed Aaron into making this idol for them, and they're dancing around and making merry in a probably orgiastic frenzy of dance and tribute to the golden calf. Joshua says, uh-oh, it sounds like they're making war down there. And Moses is like, nope, that's a party. Moses goes down and he's enraged and he breaks the tablets and he goes back up. And God says, let's, carve another set of tablets like the first, and you'll inscribe on it these words of the covenant. So it's a re-covenanting ceremony. And Moses says, oh God, please show me your face. Like that, I just want, it's the George Harrison moment of biblical theology, right? After the Beatles broke up, George releases one of the great albums in all of rock history, the triple album, All Things Must Pass. And its thesis statement is My Sweet Lord, which he was sued by, was it the Ronettes or whatever, for plagiarism of, I really want to see you. I really want to be with you. I really want to, I really want to know you. This is mystical theology rendered in a rock idiom. This is George Harrison, who was the mystical Beatle. He's the one who basically said, let's all go to India, smoke a bunch of dope, and hang out with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who brought transcendental meditation into the world. It was already there. It was part of a thousands-year-old Vedic meditation tradition that he just commercialized. But the Beatles were really down to this, and it really was brought to the West in part because of the celebrity of the Beatles getting into it. Anyway, George Harrison was really into this stuff, and his whole theology was, I want to be with you. I want to see you. I want to know you. I don't want to pray to you. I don't want to read about you. I don't want to go to a church. I want to have an experience here. And that's kind of what's being asked by Moses of God, right? Moses is like, I need to feel that you're with us. So it actually says Moses requested three things from the Kadosh Baruch Hu at that time, all of which were granted him. He requested that the divine presence rest upon Israel forever and not leave, and God granted it, as it is stated, and there's a beautiful proof text for how can it be known that I have found grace in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in that you go with us so that we are distinguished, I and your people, from all the people that are on the face of the earth? So Moses is directly asking for covenantal relationship. Go back to the very first question I asked today. I want you to be my partner, God, not just my remote boss. The request, is it not that in that you go with us refers to the resting of the divine presence upon Israel? Moses requested, this is number two, petition number two, that the divine presence not rest upon the nations of the world, and God granted it to him so that we are distinguished, I and your people. Yes, Judeo-chauvinism up front and center, nevertheless, underscoring the specialness of this bond that the Jewish people have with God. We have this uniquely close relationship. And finally, Moses requested that the ways in which God conducts the world be revealed to him. And this is where things get a little bit interesting. And God granted it to him, as it is said, show me your ways and I will know you. What did Moses really want to know? So Moses has this unique, close audience with God. And Moses said before God, Master of the universe, why is it that the righteous prosper, the righteous suffer, the wicked prosper, and the wicked suffer? And I actually do want to end there today because I think it's astonishing. You get a moment alone with God, right? In this case, it's not the story of Rabbi Yishmael where God says, bless me, my child. And Yishmael says, please, please, please remember that you have such greater capacity for compassion than you do for anger. Keep that in mind when you deal with us, the Jewish people. Moses, who had, of course, a unique relationship with God, as attested throughout the Torah itself, and the rabbis emphasize that perhaps only Moses could have said this. You know, God, now that I have you alone, I've got a few things to ask you. One, please just be with us. Don't go away. Like, we need you. Two, please make sure that this is true for the whole Jewish people, that we'll always be together. Like, this is not about law and fidelity. This is about a marriage. Like, that's what comes to mind for me. Moses is speaking the way you would speak to your partner before, deciding that it's time for to put a ring on it. Let's always be together, right? I really want to see you. I want to be with you. And finally, and God said, okay. And then finally, Moses said, while I have you here, can you explain the way that you work? Like, why do bad people suffer? Why do bad people prosper and righteous people suffer? The number one human question, like the most bedeviling question of all. The answer I would tell you, if you want to go do your own homework between now and next week, is very unsatisfying. God says, well, if there's a righteous person who is suffering, it's because his parents must have been bad. And if there's a wicked person who's prospering, it's because his parents must have been good. That's not like again, I just don't buy it. And I'm happy to call out the rabbis on in such a theologically rich passage. It is such a letdown of a coda, which is why I didn't even want to study it together. But okay, it's in the Talmud. The Talmud's not perfect. But I love just ending with Moses's question. Like, now that you've agreed we're always going to be together, and it comes back to the very first comment that was shared this morning. It was my mom who said, "What would you want that partnership to look? What could that partnership look like? What would it look like?" Honesty. Like, just tell me, why are things the way they are? Why do we suffer? What does it mean to be a human being? Like, I want you, God, in my life, not just for laws and mitzvahs. I want you in my life to help me grapple with the great mystery of the human condition. Wow. So that's where we have to end for today. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do before I leave, as promised. For those of you who use streaming media, I can't help you if you're still using like vinyl. We don't have a vinyl edition of the album out yet, but we're making one, I am told. But we do, however, have streaming, and there will be the ability, I think, to get the album as a CD. So I'm going to just show you this because we're really proud of this project. And Cantor Kleinman and Pete Malinverni and Andrew Yanshishin, our AV sound engineer, and a great crew at a sound studio in New Jersey, and all of my clergy colleagues, and our adult volunteer choir, and a few special guests, including Cantor Danny Mendelson and one Kelly McCormick, all are heard on this really special project. So let me just bring on screen so you can see what we're so proud of. This is Spotify, and you just need to go and look for WRT Sings, or I can copy the link to the album and I will put it in the Zoom window of our. Hang on, where's the chat window here? I should have it. They keep changing the format here. Chat, found it. All right, so there's a link. And if you want to just go into the chat window and click on that link or copy it, if you know how to do that, you can actually listen to the album wherever you have your streaming media. And if you use Apple Music, same thing. You can go onto Apple Music and just search for WRT Sings or Westchester Reformed Temple. The album is called WRT Sings. It's a little over an hour and it's beautifully produced. It's 20 songs that really are a snapshot of the music of WRT right now. It's the first album we've done in over 8 years. Again, we're really proud of it. And if you use other streaming media like Tidal, it's up there too. So please enjoy. Mom and Dad, thought, question?
I just wanted to ask you if you would perhaps next week discuss Rashi's comment on Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov,
Great.
because it's the perfect opportunity, but we didn't have the time. But I really think you should bring forth, if you would be so kind,
The
that
Rashi.
teaching next week.
The Rashi on Matovu, I'm happy to.
Okay.
In the meantime, I hope to see many of you tonight, and that's it. Thanks. Bye.